I was 30 when I met Brett at Sarah's backyard cookout. And honestly, he wasn't my usual type at all. Most of the guys I dated were other medical professionals, or at least college graduates. But there was something refreshing about his complete lack of pretense. He was 28, worked as a forklift operator at some warehouse. And when he offered to grab me another drink, he actually listened when I said I preferred wine over beer. Not exactly groundbreaking stuff. But after dating a string of doctors who spent entire conversations talking about themselves, Brett's genuine interest in what I had to say felt almost novel. Sarah had been trying to set me up with people for months after my last relationship crashed and burned. But Brett wasn't even supposed to be a setup. He was just there, helping her boyfriend move their new grill. And somehow we ended up talking for 3 hours about everything except work. When he asked for my number, he actually seemed nervous, which was kind of adorable in a way I hadn't expected to find attractive. The first few months of dating were honestly pretty great. Brett would show up at my house with coffee from this little place near his work, and he'd rub my feet after particularly brutal 12-hour shifts without me even asking. He wasn't trying to impress me with expensive restaurants or fancy weekend trips like other guys had. Instead, he'd cook these elaborate dinners and get genuinely excited when I liked them. It felt comfortable and easy in a way my previous relationships never had. When we got married after 2 years of dating, it made perfect sense for him to move into my house. I'd bought it with my nursing salary before we even met, and his apartment was basically a studio with a kitchen that barely qualified as functional. Brett seemed thrilled about the whole arrangement, talking about how he wanted to help with the mortgage and maybe eventually we could renovate the basement. He had all these plans about building me a home office and creating a better storage system for my medical textbooks. The thing is, Brett was almost too supportive sometimes. When I started getting restless with my hospital position and mentioned wanting to try travel nursing, he immediately started researching companies and helping me update my resume. Most guys would have complained about their wife being gone for weeks at a time, but Brett just kept saying how proud he was that I was ambitious enough to take on new challenges. He'd pack little care packages for my assignments and text me good morning every single day, asking about my patients and whether I was eating enough. But after a few travel assignments, I started noticing things that bothered me. Brett would get so excited when I called that he'd interrupt his dinner, or pause whatever show he was watching, and then spend 20 minutes asking detailed questions about my day like he was genuinely fascinated by every mundane detail. It was sweet, I guess, but also kind of pathetic how his whole evening revolved around our phone call. Meanwhile, I was working with doctors and specialists who were handling life or death situations, and I'd come back to Brett asking whether I remembered to take pictures of the hotel breakfast buffet. The travel nursing money was incredible, way more than I'd ever made at the hospital, and it felt amazing to be the primary breadwinner for once. Brett would joke about being a kept man and say he was going to retire early and become a house husband. But there was something about his complete comfort with the arrangement that started to irritate me. Like, shouldn't he be motivated to advance his own career instead of just being content to coast on my success? It was during my third assignment, in Denver, that Sarah mentioned her friend Marcus was working at the same hospital system. She thought it would be nice for me to know someone in the area, and when she introduced us over video chat, I was immediately struck by how different he was from Brett. Marcus was a cardiologist, obviously brilliant, and when we met for coffee, our conversation flowed in ways I'd almost forgotten were possible. He understood the pressures of medical work, the weight of making decisions that affected people's lives, the intellectual challenge of complex cases. Brett would try to engage when I talked about work, but I could see his eyes glaze over when I mentioned medication protocols or patient complications. He'd nod and make supportive sounds, but it was clear he was just waiting for me to finish so he could tell me about some funny thing that happened at the warehouse. Marcus, on the other hand, would ask follow-up questions that showed he actually understood what I was dealing with. When I mentioned a particularly difficult patient, he'd share similar experiences and offer insights that actually helped me think through the situation differently. We started meeting for coffee regularly, then dinner, and I found myself looking forward to our conversations more than my nightly phone calls with Brett. It wasn't that I didn't love Brett, but being around Marcus reminded me of who I was outside of being someone's wife. I was a skilled professional with valuable expertise and interesting opinions, not just the person who brought home the bigger paycheck while my husband got excited about grinding coffee beans. When Marcus first kissed me after dinner one evening, I should have stopped it immediately. Instead, I kissed him back and felt more alive than I had in months. We ended up in my hotel room, and afterwards, as I was lying there trying to process what had just happened, Marcus talked about how refreshing it was to be with someone who understood his world. He said he'd dated nurses before, but I was different because I could actually challenge him intellectually and keep up with his references to medical journals and research studies. I knew what I was doing was wrong, but it also felt inevitable in a way that was hard to explain. This wasn't some random hookup or meaningless fling. Marcus and I had a connection that went beyond physical attraction. We were intellectual equals in a way Brett and I had never been. And for the first time in my marriage, I felt like I was with someone who truly saw and appreciated who I was. The guilt was manageable because I kept the two parts of my life completely separate. When I talked to Brett, I focused on being the loving wife he expected, asking about his day and sharing carefully edited versions of mine. When I was with Marcus, I could be my full professional self without having to translate everything into terms a forklift operator would understand. It wasn't that I was trying to hurt Brett, but I also couldn't deny that I'd found something with Marcus that I didn't even know I was missing. Brett never questioned my explanations about working late or grabbing dinner with colleagues. He trusted me completely, which made everything easier but also somehow more annoying. His blind faith in my fidelity felt almost insulting, like he couldn't imagine that someone like me might want more than what our marriage offered. When I'd tell him the hotel Wi-Fi was spotty or that I was too tired to talk long, he'd just say he understood and that he was proud of how hard I was working. The text messages with Marcus started getting more intense as our relationship developed. He'd send me things like, "I can't wait to see you again," and "last night was amazing." And I'd respond with equally romantic messages. It felt like being a teenager again, having this secret relationship that existed in its own bubble. Marcus would tell me about his day, his difficult cases, his frustrations with hospital politics, and I could actually contribute meaningfully to those conversations. Meanwhile, Brett's texts were full of updates about his coworkers and questions about what I wanted him to pick up from the grocery store. He'd send me pictures of dinners he was making and ask if I thought he should add more seasoning. The contrast was so stark it was almost painful. Here was Marcus, discussing groundbreaking cardiac procedures and sharing articles from medical journals, while Brett was asking whether I preferred the red bell peppers or the yellow ones. I started finding excuses to extend my assignments or take contracts that were further from home. The physical distance made it easier to maintain the emotional distance I needed to keep both relationships going. Brett would miss me and count down the days until I came home, while Marcus and I would make plans for our next dinner or weekend together. It was like living two completely different lives. And honestly, the life with Marcus felt more like who I really was. The whole situation continued for months without any major complications. Brett remained completely oblivious, continuing his routine of making me coffee and rubbing my feet when I was home, never questioning why I seemed distracted or less interested in physical intimacy. I told myself that what he didn't know couldn't hurt him, and that I was actually being kind by sparing him the knowledge that his wife had outgrown their marriage. But apparently Brett wasn't as clueless as I thought. One night when I was between assignments, sleeping in our bed after a particularly intense few days with Marcus, Brett must have seen my phone buzzing and decided to check my messages. I was completely exhausted and sleeping deeply, so I had no idea he was reading through months of romantic texts between Marcus and me. The crazy part is that Brett didn't wake me up or confront me immediately. Instead, he just went to work the next morning like nothing had happened. I had no idea anything was wrong until a week later when someone knocked on our door and handed me divorce papers. I was so shocked I couldn't even process what was happening at first. When Brett came home that evening, I was waiting with the papers in my hand, completely blindsided. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked him. "We could have worked this out. Please don't do this." I genuinely couldn't understand why he was being so dramatic about everything. People go through rough patches in marriages all the time, and the mature thing to do is talk through problems, not run straight to lawyers like some kind of vindictive teenager. Brett just looked at me with this calm expression and said, "You messed up. You knew what you were doing?" He didn't raise his voice or get emotional, which was almost more infuriating than if he'd screamed at me. I tried to explain that I'd been lonely, that the long-distance thing was harder than either of us had anticipated, that what happened with Marcus wasn't planned or malicious. But Brett just kept saying that I'd made my choice and now he was making his. What really bothered me was how sneaky the whole thing was. Instead of coming to me like an adult and giving me a chance to explain the situation, Brett had gone behind my back to consult with some lawyer during his lunch break and had papers drawn up without saying a word. That felt way more like a betrayal than anything I'd done. At least my relationship with Marcus was based on genuine connection and compatibility, not some calculated legal strategy. I spent the next few days trying to get Brett to reconsider, explaining that what he'd found wasn't the whole story and that we could work through this if he'd just give me a chance. But he'd completely shut down, refusing to engage in any meaningful conversation about our marriage or what had gone wrong. It was like he'd flipped a switch and decided I was the enemy instead of his wife who'd made a mistake during a difficult time. The worst part was that Brett blocked my number and refused to communicate except through lawyers. I couldn't understand how someone who'd claimed to love me could just cut off all contact, like I meant nothing to him. When I tried calling from different numbers or showing up at his work, he'd just ignore me completely. It was like our entire relationship had been erased overnight, which felt incredibly cruel and immature. The divorce proceedings were a nightmare because Brett's lawyer was apparently some kind of shark who painted me as this terrible person who destroyed our marriage through infidelity. They made it sound like I was some kind of serial cheater instead of someone who developed feelings for another person during a lonely and stressful time. The whole thing was so one-sided and unfair, focusing entirely on my relationship with Marcus while ignoring all the ways our marriage had been struggling. When the judge awarded Brett 2 years of alimony, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Here I was, the one who'd worked hard to build a successful career, the one who owned our house, the one who'd been supporting both of us financially, and somehow I was supposed to pay him money because he was hurt that I had found someone more compatible. The whole system seemed designed to punish people for being honest about their feelings, instead of staying trapped in marriages that weren't working. Brett kept the no-contact thing going even after the divorce was finalized, which seemed unnecessarily harsh. A few weeks later, I called him from a different number because I thought maybe enough time had passed for him to be reasonable about everything. I admitted that yes, I'd had an affair with Marcus, but I also tried to explain that it wasn't fair for me to have to give him money when I was the one working so hard to build a career and contribute something meaningful to society. Brett just hung up and blocked that number too, which proved that he was more interested in playing the victim than actually trying to understand what had happened between us. It's been a year now since our divorce was finalized, and I'm still paying him monthly checks like he's some kind of dependent who can't take care of himself. Meanwhile, I hear through mutual friends that he's been going to the gym and saving up money to go to trade school, basically using my alimony payments to improve his life while acting like I'm the one who wronged him. The whole situation has been incredibly frustrating because nobody seems to understand that marriages are complicated and people grow in different directions sometimes. I wasn't trying to hurt Brett or destroy our relationship, but I also couldn't pretend that what I had with Marcus wasn't real and meaningful. It's not like I planned for any of this to happen, but when you meet someone who truly understands and appreciates who you are, it's hard to just ignore that connection. What bothers me most is how everyone acts like Brett is this innocent victim who did nothing wrong, when really he was just as responsible for the problems in our marriage as I was. He was content to coast along without any ambition or drive, perfectly happy to let me be the breadwinner, while he stayed in his dead-end job and acted like making coffee was some kind of grand romantic gesture. Maybe if he'd tried to better himself or shown some interest in growing as a person, I wouldn't have been so drawn to someone who actually challenged me intellectually. I still have another year of alimony payments left, and every month when I write that check, I'm reminded of how unfair the whole situation turned out to be. Brett gets to play the wronged husband while building his new life with my money, while I'm stuck dealing with the financial consequences of being honest about my feelings. It's like the system is designed to punish people for admitting that their marriages aren't perfect, instead of encouraging them to find genuine happiness and compatibility. The friends and family who've taken Brett's side act like I'm some kind of monster for falling in love with someone else, but they don't understand the pressure I was under, or how lonely those travel assignments really were. They see the affair as this black and white betrayal instead of recognizing that it was actually a symptom of deeper problems in our marriage that Brett was just as responsible for creating. Looking back, I wish I'd been braver about admitting our marriage wasn't working before I met Marcus. But I also can't regret finding someone who saw me as an equal and appreciated my intelligence and professional accomplishments. Brett was a good guy in his own way, but we were fundamentally incompatible, and it was inevitable that one of us would eventually realize we deserve something better. The fact that he's turned the whole thing into this legal and financial punishment instead of just accepting that we weren't right for each other shows exactly why our marriage was doomed from the start.